Today we're going to take a look at what's going to happen if NATO unites into one country. This video is going to be very unrealistic. All the events that are going to happen are purely fictional. Before we get into this video, I want to ask you guys to subscribe to the channel, also to the second channel. But now let's get right into the video. Already in North America, there's not much that NATO would do. So the main front lines are going to be over here. Yeah, the first initial things that we can see happening here are, we can see that Ireland finally joins NATO. I think they were not joining because of the dispute they had with the UK. And then we can see that Kosovo also joins NATO. But one day after they joined NATO, the Serbs decided to declare war. And technically speaking, they're now at war with the entirety of NATO. So we can see that NATO forces now push into Serbia. Pretty much all of the Serbian armies are destroyed. The capital city was also captured. And with that, the remaining parts of Serbia go ahead and surrender. And in a peace negotiation, we can see that all of Serbia as well as Kosovo are now a part of the NATO Union. NATO in real life would not want to expand in this way because now they are sort of like an empire, an expansionist empire. They are gonna go all out. So that is pretty much what's gonna happen here. We can see that they continue with this expansion, now going ahead and declaring war on Bosnia, who does not want to fight all these countries, so they go ahead and surrender. And finally, we can see that they send an ultimatum to Moldova, basically demanding their annexation. These guys had to accept, and only in a few months after coming to life, the NATO Union already has expanded in a pretty good way, and they're not going to be stopping here. But this whole thing is a huge threat to Russia, who even when these countries were separate was afraid of NATO. Now that it's a whole country, they are really worried for their own existence. Belarus too was scared, so Russia decides to annex them, and something crazy happens here. We can see that Ukraine almost is joining NATO, and I know in the modern day they are at war with Russia, but we're not going to be considering that. And because Ukraine is almost on the verge of joining NATO, we can see that the Russians now decide to declare war on Ukraine. But at this point, we can see that they had already joined NATO, which means that the Russians are now at war with all of NATO. And things might not be looking very good for Russia, as they were not expecting this. So let's see. We can see that at first though, the Russians started push into Ukraine. Crimea in the modern day is already under their control, but let's say that they were again able to capture Crimea, and then they go around securing all of these regions. We can see that they were also able to meet up with Kaliningrad, and the Baltic nations are cut off from mainland Europe. Their navy also comes into action, as we can see that they make a naval landing over here in Bulgaria, pushing around and securing some of these regions. They focus pretty much all of their troops in Ukraine, well, most of them. Eventually they secure all of these regions, and over here in Kaliningrad, we can see that the Russians now started pushing to Poland, and here they're using pretty much all of their military equipment. These troops in Ukraine push up, meeting up with the main Russian army up here, after which the eastern parts surrender. The troops in Bulgaria now push into Romania, and from here they enter Ukraine, meeting up with the main armies up here, and now there is this kind of a front line. And we can see that they start another push into Finland, where they basically captured Helsinki. I mean, at least as of right now, it seems like Russia is winning this war. The troops in Bulgaria now start to push down, cutting off the Turks from mainland Europe. But yeah, at this point, we can see that all of NATO was able to militarize, and they were able to send all of these troops to the front lines. The first thing that we can see happening here is the Turks now push back the Russians, pushing them all the way out of Turkey. Up here in Finland, the Russians again get pushed back all the way to their borders, and we can see that the NATO forces now push into Kaliningrad. All of this is happening because the US forces had arrived. A breakthrough happens here. The Baltic nations are again connected to mainland Europe, and the Russian troops are getting pushed back. But in the Ukrainian front lines, they are still pushing into the NATO territory. Down here we can see that the Turks and the Greeks now push back the Russians, and pretty much all the Balkan armies arrive, pushing all these guys back. Up here the Russians get pushed back again. Now they are pushed back all the way to their borders, and we can see that most of the US troops now go up here, with their main goal being the capture of St. Petersburg, which is a main Russian city. Because of getting pushed back in the north, the Russians now start to retreat from Ukraine. They send most of their troops up here, because of which they get pushed back in Ukraine. They get pushed back real bad, eventually losing a lot of territory. But the NATO troops were slowed down up here, and they were not able to capture St. Petersburg. Another army now pushes into Russia, or what was previously Belarus, securing Minsk. And in a few months, because there weren't much Russian forces down here. They secured all of these regions, and because there are a lot of Russian troops up here, the NATO forces go down, and now they start a push into Ukraine. They liberate Crimea, and now they start a push into the Russian majority provinces, and all of the remaining Russian troops in Ukraine now retreat. At this point, the Russians are they're dying. I mean, this was pretty much the climax of this video. It was gonna be a Russia versus NATO, and even more NATO troops arrive. With the arrival of these troops, they now start to push up. We can see that St. Petersburg was captured because the Russians were overwhelmed by the NATO numbers. Both these armies now start a push towards Moscow, and the Russians are trying to push these guys back, but they're just too much overwhelmed. And by the way, in my videos, nukes are disbanded, so yeah. But eventually, both these armies were able to capture Moscow after a very bloody battle. Yeah, Moscow is pretty much captured. These encircled regions surrender, and at this point, the Russians are just losing pretty much everything. Another push is made down in the south, where all of their Black Sea coast region has been taken, and yeah, they're losing it. They're losing the war. I know that Russia would not technically lose until they lose all of these regions, but with the destruction of most of their armies on the front lines, I think that eventually at some point they would lose all of this in just a matter of years. And let's just say that they lost all of this, and after all of that, we can see that they go ahead and surrender. So now let's take a look at a peace negotiation here. And in a peace negotiation, we can see that Russia lost a significant portion of their western territory. Oh yeah, and by the way, in the remaining parts of Russia, there is now a puppet government which works under NATO. But yeah, that happened. Always forget about Kaliningrad. After the annexation of Russia, we can see that Austria joins in, and now pretty much all of Europe is under NATO control, except for Switzerland, but we all know we should not mess with Switzerland. And over here in the Caucasus, in order to connect these parts of Russia to Turkey, we can see that NATO declares war on Georgia. Yeah, they're really scared. Although when they start to push in, they're not able to do so very fast because of the mountainous terrain of Georgia. But eventually, after years of fighting, the capital city was captured. Most of the Georgian armies were destroyed, because of which the remaining parts of Georgia go ahead and surrender. NATO Union has done a lot of things over here in Europe. Now with the Russian threat gone, we can see that they focus elsewhere. In North America, they want to expand, so they just go ahead and declare war on Mexico. Fortunately for the Mexicans, they cannot do anything about this. So yeah, we can see that the NATO forces now push into Mexico, and they start to push around. Eventually, they start to push down the coast, securing all of these regions. Because NATO has the best navy in the world, we can see that they make a naval landing over here from the Gulf of Mexico, America, securing all of these regions. They also cut off Baja California from mainland Mexico, which then goes ahead and surrenders. They make another naval landing down here, and these troops push around, meeting up with the main army up in the north. Most of the highly populated regions of Mexico were secured, and with all of this death and destruction, we can see that the remaining parts of Mexico surrender. In a peace negotiation, we can see that all of Mexico got completely annexed by the NATO Union. This is the NATO empire at its peak. So this is going to be it for today's video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment, and tell me what you guys want to see in the future. Thank you for watching.